"Evelyn, why are you even coming to this party?" The voice cracked through the air before I even stepped inside the hall. I paused at the doorway, my fingers grazing the edge of the mahogany frame, noticing how everything seemed smaller than I remembered. The table stretched long, perfectly polished, candles and crystal holders flickering faintly, but the chairs were empty. I had spent days planning this birthday, choosing the exact shade of blue for my dress that my late husband, Robert, had always loved, arranging the flowers just so, and ensuring every place card bore the correct name and neat handwriting. I moved slowly toward the table, noting the glint of silverware, the untouched plates, the untouched appetizers, and the quiet hum of the air conditioner filling a space that should have been alive with laughter and chatter. My heart did not sink because I was surprised. I had already feared this emptiness, but because it was confirmed. I set my purse on the nearest chair, letting my coat slip from my shoulders as I scanned the room, a practiced smile on my face, concealing the storm gathering inside. Michael should have been here, bustling with his usual energy, teasing me about the table setting. Sophia, with her calm, precise movements, should have been helping with the arrangement or greeting the guests. Yet the room remained undisturbed, the silence heavier than any words could have been. I walked to the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the edge, and inhaled the faint scent of the floral arrangements mingled with the candles. I noticed the clock above the fireplace, its hands creeping forward, and the realization struck me again. No one was coming. I took a steadying breath and adjusted my dress, feeling the texture of silk between my fingers, focusing on the present rather than the absence. My reflection in the polished surface of the china cabinet caught my eye. Silver hair neatly styled, blue eyes that had seen decades of joy and sorrow, and a face marked by experience yet calm in its control. I reminded myself that the room, the hall, and this day were still mine. I traced my fingers over the place cards, the familiar names of children and grandchildren, and allowed a quiet acknowledgement of disappointment to pass, without letting it define me. The air felt different, cooler somehow, as though the walls themselves were aware of the tension between expectation and reality. I moved toward the dessert table, glancing at the chocolate cake I had baked in the early morning, its surface smooth and decorated with delicate piped flowers. Not a single candle had been lit by anyone but me. I held the cake in my hands, rotated it slowly, and placed it back, feeling the weight of solitude but also the clarity it brought. A notification sounded faintly on my phone, another reminder that the guests were elsewhere, celebrating, oblivious to the effort and care I had poured into this day. I smiled to myself, a quiet, controlled movement that held no bitterness, only observation. Each moment in the empty hall allowed me to see not just the absence of my family but the patterns that had led to this. The missed calls, the forgotten gatherings, the subtle prioritization of convenience over connection. I walked back to the center of the room, adjusted a chair that had shifted slightly, and stood still, letting the silence speak. This birthday, this carefully orchestrated day, was mine to witness, and though the chairs remained empty, the truth of who cared, who noticed, and who valued my presence became clearer in the stillness. I set my hands lightly on the back of the chair, took a final glance at the candles casting long shadows, and allowed the quiet to settle over me, not as a defeat, but as a lens through which to understand the coming hours, the coming confrontations, and the lessons I would carry forward from this solitude. The hall remained still as I walked slowly toward the front windows, watching the sunlight shift across the polished floor. Each beam highlighted the careful arrangement of the place settings I had prepared, the crystal glasses catching the light in a way that made the emptiness more apparent. I ran my fingers over the folded napkins, noting the faint scent of lavender I had sprayed to add a welcoming touch, and yet the space felt cold, lacking the warmth of family voices. I moved toward the sideboard, adjusting a vase that had leaned slightly, and allowed my gaze to sweep over the room again, noting the small details that stood out in the absence of familiar chatter. The cake, untouched and perfectly iced, sat at the end of the table, and I felt a quiet tension, a stillness that contrasted with the energy I had expected, a stark reminder of how plans and expectations could unravel quietly. I thought about Michael and Sophia, imagining them somewhere else, perhaps in a restaurant or at a gathering I would never see, enjoying themselves while I stood in the empty hall. I reminded myself that this silence was informative, that it revealed patterns and choices more clearly than confrontation ever could. I walked to the center of the room, resting my hands lightly on the back of a chair, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palms, and took a slow breath, letting it out carefully. I thought of past birthdays and holidays, the laughter and chaos that had once filled this house, and I let those memories wash over me without anger, only clarity. I moved toward the buffet, checking the arrangement of hors d'oeuvres and the subtle placement of candles, noting that even in careful preparation, control over the outcomes had always been partial. The room was a mirror to the dynamics I had lived with for decades, the small gestures, the overlooked signals, the gradual accumulation of choices made by others that shaped my experience. I walked to the windows, resting my hands against the cool glass, looking out at the garden where the sunlight glimmered across the lawn, reflecting on how life sometimes placed us in positions to observe more than participate, to understand more than react. I let my thoughts settle on the ways in which silence could be powerful, how the act of noticing, of recording the nuances of absence and presence, could form the foundation for understanding, for eventual response. The air smelled faintly of the wax from the candles, the floral arrangements, a scent that reminded me of care and effort, and I allowed myself a quiet appreciation for the preparation itself, independent of the reactions of others. I adjusted the chair at the head of the table one last time, noting the subtle shift in light as afternoon moved toward evening, and I considered the choices that would come next, the steps I would take once observation and reflection had clarified the landscape of intentions and priorities. Standing there, in the quiet hall filled with evidence of thought, planning, and careful attention, I felt a mixture of solitude and resolve, a readiness to act when the moment demanded, and a calm awareness that perception and patience could be as potent as confrontation and force. The afternoon light shifted through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the polished wooden floor. Evelyn stood near the sideboard, her hands resting lightly on the smooth surface as she scanned the hall once again. She noticed the subtle shift in the air, a quiet presence at the doorway, and turned slightly to see Sophia entering, her posture stiff, a calculated smile barely hiding impatience. Evelyn observed without a word, noting the way Sophia's eyes flicked toward the unused plates and untouched silverware. The room seemed to hold its breath, each moment stretching longer than expected, and Evelyn allowed herself to feel the stillness as a lens through which to understand the intentions around her. She walked slowly toward the dessert table, her fingers brushing over the polished surface, pausing at the cake she had baked with care. The chocolate frosting glistened under the sunlight, untouched, a reminder of the effort and love she had poured into the day, and the absence of acknowledgement. She thought about Michael, imagining him just beyond the threshold, distracted, unaware of the tension that lay thick in the room, and realized how small gestures and patterns of avoidance over time had led to this silent moment. Evelyn adjusted a chair, noticing the slight tilt and the faint scent of lavender from the floral arrangements mixed with the wax of the candles, creating a sensory map of preparation and care unnoticed. She walked toward the center of the hall, hands lightly resting on the back of a chair, observing Sophia as she moved through the space, her actions deliberate, as if testing boundaries, and Evelyn understood the dynamics at play without needing to speak. She allowed herself a slow, measured breath, thinking of the past birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings where small omissions had accumulated into this palpable sense of neglect. Each memory connected like pieces of a puzzle, forming a larger picture of patterns, priorities, and choices. Evelyn considered how patience and perception had given her the clarity to see beyond immediate reactions, to witness behavior over time, and to recognize the subtle manipulations that had shaped her experiences. She turned her gaze toward the windows, the garden beyond glimmering under the afternoon sun, and felt the quiet strength in simply standing and observing, noting every expression, every hesitation, and every unspoken decision. The room remained filled with the echo of absence, yet Evelyn felt a sense of readiness, a calm awareness that she could act thoughtfully when the moment demanded. She allowed herself to move methodically, adjusting a place card, smoothing a napkin, and arranging the candlesticks with precision, each motion deliberate, reflecting control over her environment even when others had chosen to disregard her presence. Evelyn walked slowly to the head of the table, placing her hands lightly on the surface, and surveyed the empty chairs, the room, and the light, taking in every detail with clarity. She considered how observation, reflection, and measured attention could be as powerful as confrontation, understanding that her awareness of patterns, omissions, and intentions was the foundation upon which she could respond when the opportunity presented itself. The hall was quiet, filled with the soft glint of sunlight on crystal, the faint aroma of flowers and candles, and the subtle energy of preparation awaiting acknowledgement. Evelyn stood still for a long moment, letting the clarity of the space and her reflections settle over her, reinforcing a sense of quiet power and readiness, the understanding that perception, patience, and careful observation could shape the next steps she would take, all while the room held the evidence of care, effort, and a presence that had been overlooked but not diminished. The sun was lowering in the sky, casting a warm golden light across the empty chairs and polished surfaces of the hall. Evelyn walked slowly along the length of the table, her fingertips grazing the edges of the crystal glasses, noting the slight reflections in each one. She paused at the centerpiece, a carefully arranged bouquet of white lilies and pale blue hydrangeas, and inhaled the subtle fragrance, allowing the scent to anchor her thoughts. Memories of past gatherings surfaced, the laughter, the small arguments, the shared stories that once filled this space with life, and she allowed herself a quiet reflection on each moment, observing how small choices and subtle behaviors had accumulated over the years to create the current emptiness. She thought about Michael and Sophia, imagining their routines, their priorities, and how each decision they made seemed to distance them from her despite the closeness she had once expected. Evelyn moved to the sideboard, adjusting a vase slightly so that the arrangement appeared symmetrical, her movements deliberate and precise, a meditation on attention and care. She noticed a small smudge on the polished surface and wiped it away, noting how her focus on details had always been a way to maintain order in a world that often overlooked her contributions. The sunlight shifted again, creating patterns across the floor that reminded her of the passage of time, the inevitability of change, and the need for clarity in perception. She walked toward the head of the table, resting her hands on the edge and looking down at the place cards she had carefully written by hand, each name a reminder of relationships, expectations, and subtle disappointments accumulated over the years. Evelyn considered how observation and patience had allowed her to understand patterns in behavior, how the small omissions, the delayed calls, the unnoticed efforts, all revealed intentions more clearly than words could. She walked toward the windows, resting her hands against the cool glass, and looked out at the garden, noticing the way the sunlight caught the leaves and the gentle sway of the branches in the breeze, a calm counterpoint to the quiet tension in the hall. She reflected on how her presence had been undervalued, how effort had gone unnoticed, and yet how these observations gave her the power to respond thoughtfully when the time was right. Evelyn moved back into the center of the room, standing still and taking slow, measured breaths, feeling the weight of the day, the significance of what she had prepared, and the clarity of her understanding of the dynamics at play. Each movement, each observation, each reflection strengthened a quiet resolve within her, the understanding that awareness and careful attention could shape the responses she would choose, the lessons she would carry forward, and the measured actions she would take. She adjusted the napkins on the table, smoothed the folds, and placed the candles in their holders with precision, each motion a silent assertion of control and calm. The hall was quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of leaves outside, and Evelyn stood at the head of the table, fully aware of the power in observing, in reflecting, and in allowing clarity to guide her next steps. As the afternoon sun continued its descent, Evelyn shifted her focus from the empty table to the small study at the far end of the hall, a place she had often used to reflect and write letters that were rarely sent. She walked slowly across the polished floor, feeling the subtle creak under her feet, and opened the door to the study, letting her eyes adjust to the softer light within. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, familiar and comforting, a sanctuary from the tension of the main hall. She moved to the desk, her fingers tracing the grain of the surface, noting the small imperfections and memories embedded in the material. On the desk lay her journal, open to a page where she had carefully recorded past birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings, a chronology of both joy and quiet disappointment. Evelyn allowed herself a slow breath and began reviewing the entries, each one a reminder of her awareness of patterns and choices over the years. She noticed subtle signs she had overlooked before: canceled plans, postponed visits, excuses that now revealed an underlying indifference. Her mind traced the trajectory of these events, connecting small moments into a larger picture, understanding the intentions and priorities of those around her. She reached for a stack of photographs on the desk, flipping through images of family events, noting expressions, positioning, and the interactions between Michael, Sophia, and the children. The photos spoke volumes in silence, offering clues that words had often disguised. Evelyn sat down in the leather chair, allowing the quiet to envelop her, and considered the importance of observation, reflection, and patience. She understood that the accumulation of these details provided insight and power, a foundation for measured responses rather than impulsive reactions. She reflected on the lessons she had learned about attention, consistency, and human behavior, recognizing how her understanding of family dynamics could guide her in navigating the delicate balance of presence and absence, acknowledgement and oversight. She placed a photograph back carefully, smoothing the edges, and allowed her thoughts to turn toward the upcoming evening, considering how she might interact with the family without revealing all that she had perceived, how to maintain composure while testing boundaries, and how to gauge sincerity and intention through subtle cues. The study, with its quiet ambience, soft shadows, and familiar objects, became a space where clarity and resolve merged, reinforcing Evelyn's understanding that her actions would be deliberate, controlled, and impactful when the moment arrived. She rose slowly, moving back toward the hall, adjusting her dress and smoothing her silver hair, ready to re-enter the space with a calm and measured awareness. Each step a testament to the power of observation, reflection, and intentionality in a world that often overlooked her presence but could not diminish her insight. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Evelyn walked deliberately along the edge of the hall, her eyes scanning the empty chairs, the carefully arranged plates, and the flickering candlelight. She felt the quiet weight of anticipation in the room, a tension that was neither loud nor forceful but unmistakable. Each detail she observed, the tilt of a glass, the slight displacement of a napkin, the angle of a chair, told a story of absence, choices, and subtle neglect. She moved toward the table where the desserts sat, noticing the chocolate cake she had baked with careful attention, untouched and perfect, the frosting reflecting the warm light. She paused to smooth a stray flower petal on the centerpiece, allowing the rhythm of small actions to ground her in patience and clarity. Her thoughts drifted to Michael and Sophia, imagining their movements, their preoccupations, and the unspoken decisions that had led to this quiet, charged moment. Evelyn understood that observation could reveal intentions more clearly than confrontation, that patterns of behavior accumulated over time provided insight into the priorities and values of those around her. She moved to the sideboard, straightening a small stack of plates, noting the faint fragrance of lavender from the floral arrangements mingling with the wax of the candles, a sensory reminder of care and effort unnoticed. Each motion was deliberate, a silent assertion of presence, a calm demonstration of control over her environment. She stepped back to the center of the hall, resting her hands lightly on the back of a chair, and allowed her gaze to take in the entire room, the polished surfaces, the empty chairs, the sunlight reflecting off the crystal. She considered how her awareness of the subtleties, the glances, the hesitations, the small gestures, provided her with the knowledge to act with intention when the moment required. The hall was quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Yet within this stillness, Evelyn felt a growing sense of readiness. She walked slowly to the windows, resting her palms against the cool glass, observing the garden beyond, the shifting light, and the gentle movement of branches in the breeze. She reflected on the power of patience, the the strength in quiet observation, and the importance of discerning motives before taking action. Each step she took back toward the table, each careful adjustment of the tableware, reinforced a calm, measured presence, a silent preparation for the interactions to come. Evelyn stood in the center of the hall, taking deliberate breaths, feeling the weight of the room, the significance of her efforts, and the clarity of her understanding, knowing that in this space of stillness, she had cultivated both insight and quiet power, ready to respond when the moment presented itself. The evening light began to soften, spilling through the tall windows and casting long, warm shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Evelyn moved quietly to the center of the hall, her eyes scanning the empty chairs and untouched table settings, each one reflecting a story of absence and overlooked effort. She noticed the subtle glimmer of sunlight on the crystal glasses, the slight shift in the floral arrangements, and the faint smell of candle wax mingled with the lavender scent of the flowers, each detail a reminder of care unnoticed. She walked slowly toward the sideboard, adjusting a small stack of plates and straightening a napkin that had shifted slightly, her movements deliberate and measured, reinforcing a sense of control in the stillness. Her mind traced the patterns of past gatherings, the small omissions, the delayed responses, and the quiet prioritizations that had led to this present moment, a tapestry of intention and neglect. She paused at the dessert table, brushing her fingers over the surface of the chocolate cake she had prepared, noticing the pristine icing and delicate decorations, untouched by anyone else, a symbol of effort unacknowledged yet fully realized. Evelyn allowed herself to take a slow, steady breath, grounding her awareness in the room, observing the nuances of light, shadow, and reflection, each element providing insight into the behavior and priorities of those around her. She moved toward the windows, resting her hands lightly on the cool glass, watching the garden beyond, the branches swaying gently in the breeze, sunlight catching on the leaves, a calm counterpoint to the tension of the empty hall. She reflected on the power of perception, the value of patience, and the strength found in quiet observation, understanding that awareness offered a strategic advantage over immediate reaction. Evelyn returned to the center of the room, letting her gaze move deliberately over the table, the chairs, the crystal, the candles, and the flowers, registering each detail and imprint left by her careful preparation. She thought of Michael and Sophia, their routines, choices, and the subtle signs she had noticed over time, understanding their priorities without needing to speak or confront. She walked slowly along the perimeter of the hall, allowing each step to reinforce her presence, her calm authority, and her readiness to respond thoughtfully when the moment presented itself. The room remained quiet, filled only with the faint hum of the air conditioner, the soft rustle of leaves outside, and the subtle shifts of light across the polished surfaces. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the chair back, taking a measured breath, feeling the quiet power in observation, reflection, and deliberate attention, knowing that her understanding of patterns, priorities, and intentions would guide her in the moments to come, and that calm, patient awareness could hold as much influence as any overt action. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the late evening sun, the light filtering through the tall windows and casting gentle reflections across the polished hardwood floor. Evelyn moved slowly toward the head of the table, her fingers lightly grazing the surface of the tablecloth, noting the intricate stitching and the subtle texture that spoke of careful preparation and attention to detail. She paused to adjust a place card that had shifted slightly, her movements deliberate, measured, and unhurried, each gesture reinforcing her presence without a single word spoken. She glanced around the hall, observing the empty chairs, the untouched silverware, and the unlit candles, each detail a testament to her efforts and the care she had taken to prepare the day. Her eyes lingered on the floral centerpiece, a mix of white lilies and pale blue hydrangeas, their petals catching the fading sunlight, and she took a slow, steady breath, letting the quiet of the room ground her awareness. Evelyn reflected on the subtle patterns of behavior she had noticed over time, the delayed responses, the overlooked acknowledgments, the small gestures that accumulated into larger truths about the intentions of those around her. She moved to the sideboard, smoothing a napkin and adjusting the alignment of a set of crystal glasses, feeling the calm power that came from meticulous observation and thoughtful action. Her mind traced the trajectory of previous gatherings, noting the ways in which her presence had been undervalued, the ways effort had gone unnoticed, and how these patterns provided insight into the priorities and choices of her family. She walked to the windows, placing her hands lightly on the cool glass, and looked out at the garden beyond, the branches swaying gently in the breeze, the sunlight catching on the leaves, offering a quiet counterpoint to the stillness of the hall. Evelyn considered the lessons embedded in these moments of solitude, the strength and patience, the clarity that comes from careful observation, and the power in understanding intentions before acting. She returned to the center of the room, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, taking in the full space with deliberate awareness, noting the subtle shifts in light and shadow, the faint scent of lavender from the flowers, and the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Each movement, each observation, each detail reinforced a sense of control and readiness, a measured calm that contrasted with the absence surrounding her. Evelyn allowed herself to feel the full weight of her experience, the clarity gained through reflection, and the quiet anticipation of the moments to come. She stood for several long moments, breathing deliberately, observing the room and the evidence of her efforts, understanding that awareness, patience, and thoughtful attention could shape her next actions with precision and subtlety, and that even in silence, she held the power to influence, to understand, and to respond in ways that would leave an impact without raising a voice or breaking the calm of the evening. The evening had settled fully across the house, soft shadows stretching long across the polished floor, blending with the fading glow from the windows. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the back of the central chair, her gaze sweeping over the carefully arranged plates, crystal glasses, and the floral centerpiece that had been untouched throughout the day. She inhaled slowly, the faint scent of candles and lavender filling her senses, grounding her awareness and heightening her perception of every subtle detail around her. She considered the patterns she had observed, the delayed messages, the missed calls, the small acts of disregard, and understood the larger picture. They formed about the priorities and intentions of Michael and Sophia. Her mind traced back through past gatherings, noting the accumulation of quiet omissions and overlooked efforts, the way her presence had been undervalued while her attention and care went unnoticed. Evelyn walked along the length of the table, adjusting a napkin here, straightening a glass there, each motion deliberate and precise, reinforcing a quiet authority in the room that demanded recognition without a single word spoken. She paused at the dessert table, her fingers brushing lightly over the smooth surface of the chocolate cake, noticing the perfect icing and intricate decorations, and allowed herself a brief moment to appreciate her own meticulous preparation. Moving toward the windows, she rested her hands on the cool glass and observed the garden beyond, the last of the sunlight catching on the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the lawn, a soft contrast to the stillness inside the hall. Evelyn reflected on the lessons she had gathered through patience, observation, and careful attention, realizing that understanding intentions before acting provided clarity and influence more potent than immediate confrontation. She returned to the center of the room, standing tall and taking a measured breath, feeling the energy of the space and the quiet power it afforded her, the calm authority she could wield simply through presence and perception. Each step she took back toward the table, each adjustment she made, was an assertion of control, a demonstration of deliberate action shaped by reflection rather than impulse. Evelyn surveyed the hall once more, noting the subtle interplay of light, shadow, and the quiet ambience, understanding that the careful observation she had maintained throughout the day had given her insight into the dynamics of her family. She allowed herself a slow smile, restrained but potent, a signal to herself that preparation and awareness would guide her choices when interaction came, that clarity and patience could shape outcomes with precision, and that in this quiet, deliberate presence, she had cultivated power, readiness, and the capacity to respond in ways both measured and meaningful. Standing there, at the center of the hall with the evening sun fading, Evelyn felt a sense of completion for the day's observations, a readiness for the interactions ahead, and the confidence that through careful attention, reflection, and deliberate action, She could influence and navigate the family dynamics with grace, control, and a calm strength that carried its own quiet authority.